This week, I wanted to say something about how we might review and develop our practice of metta for people with whom we have difficulties. So let's have a little look at the map of our racing track for the evening. So I'm going to say something about how we might do that, review our sense of aversion, say something about types, including the hate type. I've got a couple of great examples from the Buddhist tradition, and then a more contemporary example that I'm going to share. Thanks, Emma. So when I've introduced the Mettā Bhavana to people for the first time, quite a common response to the fourth stage from people is, I don't have a problem with anyone. There's no one I dislike, let alone feel strong enough to say that there's any sort of form of hatred. So I want to start with that. So without denying that may be our experience, I think it's important to just reflect on this and check that we're not just subtly pushing people out of our mind and out of our life. Just check that we're not actually unconsciously avoiding someone, and because we therefore have less or even no contact with them, we start to feel, I don't really have a problem with them anymore. So when we experience difficulty with someone, rather than turn away or even push them away, which of course is a form of aversion, what we should really be doing is turning towards them, looking into what is it in us that's creating that sense of aversion, rather than looking at what's wrong with the other person. And the 5th century Theravadan, Buddhaghosa, one of the many figures on our refuge tree of inspiration, describes in his great work, the Sthiranāga, different temperaments. And he describes 3 pairs of temperaments, in a sense, a positive and a negative variation of the 3 poisons of greed, hatred, and delusion. And in my experience, I've definitely found this sort of labeling useful, but I've also found that it has its limitations. So 20 years ago, when I was an alcoholic, I would definitely say that I was a greed type. I could see that very clearly in the destructive craving that was in my life. And now, despite being sober for more than 15 years, until only a few years ago, I still sort of labeled myself and thought of myself as a greed type. But what I've realized is that my individual actions, action on action, can actually have at their root any one of those 6 temperaments described by Buddhaghosa. So I can just as easily act out of hatred, even though my primary tendency may still be towards greed. So in fact, when I notice negative tendencies these days, they are much more likely to be aversion-based rather than greed-based. Because over the last decade or so, I've been able to cultivate more and more the positive counterpoint to greed, and that, according to Buddhaghosa, is faith, more specifically faith in the 3 jewels. So if you think you don't experience any aversion and you love everyone, just spend a little bit of time just looking a little bit more closely at how really you are engaging with other people. So one of my favorite, most graphic accounts in the Pali Canon on the subject of hatred and violence is from the Majjhima Nikaya, and it's known as the parable of the saw. And in brief, some of the Buddha's monks hear him being severely and unjustly criticized. They get very upset and they go to the Buddha and they tell him something has to be done and put these people right and stop this unfair criticism. And the Buddha then says to the monks, even if bandits were to savagely sever you limb by limb with a double-handed saw, even then, whoever of you harbors ill will at heart would not be upholding my teaching. Monks, even in such a situation, you should train yourselves thus. Neither shall our minds be affected by this, nor, for this matter, shall we give vent to evil words, but we shall remain full of concern and pity with a mind of love, and we should not give in to hatred. On the contrary, we shall live projecting thoughts of universal love to those very persons, making them, as well as the whole world, the object of our thoughts of universal love. My second favorite is in Shantideva's Bodhicharya Avatar, which many of you will know, a guide to the Bodhisattva's way of life, which is a later Mahayana text. And Shantideva gives the example of someone who comes up to us and beats us with a stick. That's a painful experience, but, says Shantideva, it doesn't justify us flying into a rage. Instead, we need to try and understand what has happened. And if you analyze it, he says, it is simply that two things have come together, the stick and our body. And who is responsible for this coming together? The other person has admittedly taken the stick to us, so he's partly responsible, but we have provided the body. And where does that come from? It comes from our previous actions, those patterns of behavior that have created the conditions by which we are here now. So this is probably a very hard concept or view for us to get to grips with. But my last one is a slightly more contemporary one. So some of you will remember the story of Brian Keenan, who was captured in Beirut in 1986 and held hostage for 4.5 years. He was kept in extreme conditions during this time, and the following is a description of an incident from his book, An Evil Cradling, about one of his captors whose name was Saeed. Suddenly, the dreaming silence was shattered. Saeed was weeping great shuddering sobs. This was a different kind of weeping from the automatic religious melancholia of his prayers. He walked around the room crying. The whole room seemed to fill up with his anguish. I felt, as I never had before, great pity for this man, and felt if I could, I would reach out and touch him. I knew instinctively some of the pain and loss and longing that he suddenly found himself overwhelmed by. The weeping continued. Saeed became fleshy and human for me. He was a man truly stressed. His tears now wrenched a great wellspring of compassion from me. I wanted to nurse and console him. I felt no anger, and that defensive laughter which had before cocooned me was no longer in me. I felt my own tears. I no longer thought of him as nothing and felt guilty for having dismissed him so completely. Saeed's violence against us was a symptom of his need for us. So that's a very extreme example, and not one that any of us will hopefully have to endure. And the truly Buddhist approach towards those who hold repugnant views or who behave with such violence, of course, is one of compassion, because those people live in a realm of hell. Okay, so let's have this week's top tip. So I wanted to share a few thoughts on transforming aversion and hatred. So firstly, it's good to reflect deeply and regularly on our experience of aversion. So many of us will get a sense of this from reviewing our practice of the precepts, particularly the first precept, but actually the 3 poisons of greed, hatred, and delusion can influence our behavior across all 5 precepts. Secondly, if some of what I've said tonight has resonated already, or if you come to realize that your experience of others can be one of aversion, then there are a few basic things you can do. Firstly, it really helps to relax. Aversion can often arise when we're tight, feeling protective, even feeling defensive, and that's likely to cause tension in our body as well as our mind. So finding ways that work for you to relax can really help. And my first tip of this series in week 2 was to learn how to create joy. And again, I want to underline that here. If we spend all of our time dwelling on suffering and difficulty without an extraordinary amount of positive emotion, we will begin to experience aversion. And this may well find expression as aversion towards others. So look for the joy. When we experience aversion, look for that gap in our experience, maybe with a few deep breaths, maybe use a technique such as the 3-minute breathing practice, just to hold things in check and then reflect on what is actually going on for us. Often the root of aversion is that someone has come into conflict with views about life that we hold. Maybe we've encountered someone behaving really badly, swearing or breaking our precepts that we may feel are right and therefore must apply to everyone else, Buddhist or not. Maybe it's a politician who is clearly wrong. Well, for someone to be behaving wrongly or just plain being wrong, then we must be right, or at least we must know what is right. And that view, no matter how laudable it may seem, is the root of our aversion. So we need to hold our views more lightly, or at least not impose them on others. It's perfectly fine for us to live diligently by our precepts, but imposing these on others will lead to trouble, not least for ourselves. And although I've got no time to talk about it in detail, it's really good to introduce some reflection if we feel someone is to blame for a certain situation. So yes, it may be true that someone has contributed to some difficulty for ourselves or others, but as Shantideva was describing, there are always more conditions at work than we first realize. So no one person is ever to blame. And finally, consider the forgiveness practice, which Harsharatna introduced and in a lovely way talked us through and led us through this evening. Just think about whether you need to apply that in your life, and maybe do that in the way he suggested, on a sort of periodic basis.